1996 was the year that everything changed for gaming. 3D, open landscapes, and full 360-degree movement was now technically possible on consoles. And as such, all the attention, all the media press, and all the hype about gaming was centered exclusively on the consoles pioneering it, and the games that are playable on them. Anything else, and I mean literally anything else, was considered obsolete, old, boring, and most importantly, outdated. It didn't matter if the graphics were heavily stylized, it didn't matter if they were sequels to critically acclaimed game series, nor did it matter if they had graphics that truly got the most out of the console that they were on. If it wasn't an N64 or PS1 game that was in 3D and had big sprawling levels in it, it just didn't matter. So it's not that surprising to find out that there are tons of games on the Super Nintendo that simply didn't get the opportunity to be appreciated or even played. These were not games that broke the mold, they didn't wow anyone anymore. They weren't exciting new leaps into another world, they were just the exact same thing you already played again. And seeing how this franchise has had a history of being obsolete to the masses, it's no surprise that the 16-bit finale of Mega Man X was also quite swiftly forgotten about upon its release. Mega Man X3 came out in late 1995 in Japan and early 1996 here in the States.
No one cared, man. No one.
Absolutely nobody was playing this game when it came out. Hell, not even many avid fans of the series. They were all busy on their PS1s playing games that were cooler, better, more revolutionary. It was also met with very mixed reception from a lot of the critics that did play it, citing that while the game was technically sound and played exactly like X1 and 2, it was largely just the same thing over again, now with a bunch of things done worse. Topple that with the game selling way worse than its predecessors, and you've got yourself a game that flopped in almost every possible way. For years and years, even when a lot of these late 16-bit games eventually found their fans, X3 was always seen as a massive failure. It's a game in the series that wasn't a full-on disaster, but was seen as a pretty big embarrassment on the legacy of the X series. And as unfortunate as it is, writing was on the wall that the 16-bit Mega Man Renaissance was over. So anyways, of the 4 games that were available on the X Legacy Collection, X3 and X4 were the ones that I had absolutely zero hands-on experience with. X3 was the very last game that I decided to try out, and given its track record, I was a bit hesitant going in. I mean, even if I didn't like it, I still had 3 other insanely replayable games to go to, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. But still, I went into it with an open mind, and came out the other side actually really liking it. Like, a lot. I had my issues with it, of course, but overall, I found it to be just as fun to play as every other game in the collection. There were even a few things that I thought this game actually did better. I would end up replaying this one a lot of times since then, even more than X4. And similarly to X2, my appreciation for it has increased with every single playthrough. Fast forward to today, and to be honest, I still haven't really stopped feeling that way about X3. I still think it's a ton of fun. However, as time has gone by, I've started to notice a lot more of the flaws and rough edges that the game has. It's a very interesting game, a very strange game. It's a game that introduces a lot of things, but in doing so, it also takes a couple things away. It's a game that does have a vision, but is ultimately blinded by its intense ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds and geeks, and all my queer and non-binary peeps, this is Mega Man X3. So there's this guy named Dr. Doppler, right? And he hosts this big Maverick invasion, causing a whole bunch of chaos throughout the cities. X and Zero team up to stop him. That's it. That's all she wrote. So right off the bat, this has to be one of the lamest plots I think any Mega Man game has ever had. That's saying a lot. I know I wasn't at all thorough with my analysis, but there's nothing to analyze here. You don't get any lore like in X2, there's no interesting events that happen. It's pretty much just a carbon copy of the last 2 games, replacing Sigma with Mr. Duplo over here. But then we get to the opening stage. Now, Dr. Duplo has decided to take the fight straight to the Maverick Hunter HQ and wage a full-on attack on their base. meaning that this is technically the very first time we get to see what the HQ looks like. The music is incredibly dire and intense, the level design is on point, and most amazing of all, you can play as Zero. I was losing my mind when I first saw this. It's still pretty odd that it took until the third game to make Zero playable, but his inclusion was just so freaking awesome. This entire stage is so freaking awesome. I wouldn't say that reaches the heights of X2's opening, but it's still full of surprises, tons of action, and similarly gives the player a taste of things to come. And oh boy, things do be coming. So diving straight into the stage select, we have yet another batch of Mavericks, each having stages that are pretty solid. The level design is pretty standard, featuring a good amount of platforming and combat. Even still, when playing this game again for this video, I started to notice a few things that I never really picked up on before. Like, I don't know if it's just me, but these levels feel a lot bigger than before. It generally seems like these areas have a lot more space in them, and they feel a lot more expansive and broader than anything in the previous games. I also noticed that the enemies in this game tend to be a lot more aggressive. They hit a lot harder, they have attacks that can actually hit you, and they're all over the place in this one. Combat is emphasized the absolute most in this game, even more than X1, making X3 the hardest and most treacherous adventure so far. Personally, I didn't really mind any of this at all, in part because I didn't really mind it in X1, but it's also because I feel like the increased difficulty does kind of force you to be more alert about the things that's going on within the levels. It's fairly easy to rely on muscle memory whenever you go back and play these games, but even when I go back to it nowadays, X3 has always managed to keep me on my toes while not completely delving into cheapness. However, even though these levels are relatively unfair, there's one thing about them that absolutely is: how unfairly good this game's soundtrack is. Because oh my god, this might be one of my all-time favorite Mega Man soundtracks. I know a lot of people hold X1 as being the best of the best, but in my opinion, everything that Mega Man X music has been trying to do peaked with X3. The compositions are immaculate, with every track being filled with so much energy and, for lack of a better term, hype. But for me at least, the thing that really separates a good OST from a phenomenal one is how varied it is in terms of sound, and X3 simply delivers on it better than any other in the entire series. One song could be filled with adrenaline pumping excitement, the next could be very slow and relaxed, and the one after that could be actually quite depressing and dreary. It's just a very well crafted soundtrack, and unlike the other two, I could say that I love every single song on here. Yes, that includes the password theme. The frickin' password theme. Are you serious? So yeah, I've been giving X3 a lot of praise so far, because I still think that this is a very fun Mega Man game at its core. However, even with all that being said, this game has garnered its reputation for a reason. A reason that I can totally understand. It's bloated. It's very, very bloated. Over the years, it's becoming increasingly easier to see just how many new additions or new gadgets that this one game introduces. However, not all of these gadgets were made with equal attention, or if I'm being honest, quality. X3 adds things that tend to have more detrimental effects than beneficial ones, as a majority of the additions are either very superfluous, very annoying, or had good concepts that completely bombed it in execution. This is something that's noticeable throughout the game, but is by far the most apparent with the hidden collectibles because, my god, there are so many of these things now. Sub and heart tanks are back, armor upgrades are back, with the new ones being the collectible ride armors and the enhancement chips. Alright, let's go and take this one at a time. The fancy new armor for this game, the third armor, is a pretty big downgrade for me. I'll give it that it has some really cool ideas and concepts, but they just don't really amount to much in comparison to its predecessors. The headpiece allows you to have this little map whenever you begin the stage, and only when you begin the stage, because you're unable to bring it up during actual gameplay. That's lame. I feel like if they just added a section for it on the menu, it would have been loads more useful, because as it stands, especially nowadays with guides and the like, there is absolutely no reason to use this thing whatsoever. The chest piece is more or less the same as last time, now with a shield that when hit inside reduces the damage even more. The arm pieces have been horribly nerfed, no longer giving you the swift 1-2 blast like an X2, and instead having a taller overall shot that barely hits anything. Like, it still works fine enough, but it just doesn't feel as fun to use as before. But leave it to the leg pieces to give us by far the coolest perk, grant you the ability to dash straight up into the air. And listen, I know it doesn't look like that big of a deal, but so many collectibles and even a few levels take advantage of this to great effect. Altogether, this armor, while it does have its bright spots, is still pretty lackluster. And while I'm sure there were a bunch of different design and conceptual reasons for why it turned out that way, I still feel like the existence of another batch of upgrades might help explain why it is the way it is. Nerds and geeks, the enhancement chips. So, get this, you can actually upgrade each of the 4 armor pieces upon finding one of these pink capsules. Some of the upgrades include being able to air dash twice, being able to charge up shots automatically, being able to slowly regain your health by standing still, and reducing the amount of damage you take even further. This is such a cool and fun addition, which makes me even more mad at it because the enhancements suffer from one singular problem. You can only use one of them for the entire game. There is no option to swap between them, no option to trade one off for another to see which one you prefer using. If you pick one up, you are essentially stuck with it. Why? This is literally the only thing stopping it from becoming such a cool addition because it just needlessly restricts you for no good reason. Hell, I didn't even collect any of them for this video because 1, it's just not worth it as I don't think this even goes to your 100% completion requirements, and 2, there's another way you can get all of these upgrades without touching any of them. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. Next up, we got the ride armor sets, as X3 interestingly enough utilizes them the most out of the entire series. In previous games, all they really amounted to were vehicle segments of their respective levels. They are more or less the same here, but now come in 4 different flavors, all of which doing pretty much the exact same thing with a few special perks. Now, these are things that you also have to go out of your way to find. However, in order to use any of them, you must unlock this specific ride armor that's located in Blast Hornet stage. Why? Why would you do this, man? Like, wouldn't it make more sense to just give you the armor when you find it? I don't know, I just find something about hiding it like that to be very stupid and weird, especially when there are loads of collectibles throughout the game that require these armors to get. And that is all the collectibles in the entire game. Like I've said, actually hunting these things down is no doubt the best thing about them, but man, the effects that each of these things have on the game itself are just so whatever. They were either too limiting, too confusing, or just very half-assed and sloppy in terms of how they were executed. And unfortunately, those aren't the only things that suffer from that. As stated earlier, Zero makes his first playable debut with this game. Just click L on the pause menu and he's all yours. He comes equipped with 2 charge shots as well as the glorious introduction of the weapon that he is most associated with, Disease Saber, a weapon that can one-shot just about anything in this entire game. Now, this all seems great, until you realize that Zero can't collect a single upgrade, can't fight a single boss, can't use a single ride armor, can't die a single time, otherwise you lose him for good. Pretty much, Zero might as well be there for X's moral support, because otherwise, he is completely useless. Yet another thing about X3 that comes off as being underdeveloped and underutilized. But you know, how about we go back to being positive for a change, as X3's routing is actually really damn good. The boss design is admittedly on the easier side. Many of their attacks are very easy to read, even with the damage output being absurdly high, and the weapons are some of the best within the entire series, being very useful for item collection, as well as just being very fun to use in general. The changing stage environments after defeating a certain boss also returned as well. I still think X1 did this better, but like in that game, it adds a nice dash of complexity to selecting your next Maverick, even when a few effects make no sense. However, the special ingredient for why X3's routing works so well is thanks to Bit and Byte. To briefly go back to the story, Mr. Duplo hires 3 of his henchmen to go out and hunt for X. Bit, Byte, and Vile? Yeah, apparently Duplo found him and equipped him with better parts, making him a lot stronger and dangerous. They're pretty much on the hunt for X in a similar fashion as the X Hunters did. However, these guys do a couple of very crucial things differently. For one, the stages that they appear in are no longer random. They appear in a boss room you encounter in the middle of the stage, and depending on your luck, they'll either choose to show up or not. This is only speaking for Bit and Byte, by the way, as they seem to select stages based on a set schedule. You are always going to fight Bit before Byte, with Bit appearing in your 3rd, 4th, and 5th stage, and Byte appearing on your 6th, 7th, or 8th. So it's still technically random, but it's random among a smaller selection of stages. And seeing that there is a battle arena halfway through the stage, it's guaranteed that you're going to be fighting them at some point. I really like how this is handled. Even though I do miss the unpredictability of the X Hunters, it's just so much more easier to keep track of where these guys are going to be and make an informed prediction on where they'll go next. It also helps that the fights themselves are pretty simple and basic. These guys do have weaknesses, however, and this is a big thing that they fixed from X2, landing the final hit with their weakness actually impacts the end of the game. You hit them with their weakness and you end up killing them for good. Hit them with a buster, and they're kept alive, prompting a rematch later within the game. Like this is what X2 should have been. It shows that your actions actually matter and have consequences that impact the rest of the story. It's just a really, really good system. But Vile, on the other hand, plays by a different set of rules. So, hidden within every stage, there's this big teleporting thingamajig, and when you hop through it, you'll be transported into Vile's lair. So you pretty much run through this shorter level that has him waiting for you at the halfway point. And similarly to Bit and Byte, he'll return in the endgame if you don't kill him with his weakness. But this fight is incredibly difficult, especially with the buster, so it's a safe assumption that you will be killing him for good. You are then prompted with this chase scene, escaping the hideout with everything collapsing, and that's it. Again, a really neat side quest that also impacts the ending of the game in a decently sized way. Speaking of which, since I've been talking about it so much, how about we finally go to the ending, huh? So after he kills the last of the Mavericks, Duplo's castle rips through the earth and onto the middle of the map. Whenever you feel like you're ready, X leaps headfirst into the castle, X tasked with running through stages that are okay. Being completely honest, they're just kinda forgettable and bland for the most part. But it's here in Doppler Stage 1 where we find the alternative method of getting all 4 of those previously mentioned enhancement chips. Just slide down this wall and boom, you found the golden armor. Even though the only way you're gonna find out about this is with a guide, I still think that's a good design choice to give this to the player as soon as the endgame starts, given how much harder the game is going to get. Speaking of which, if you did decide to kill Bit, Byte, or Vile, the rematches will either be replaced with a giant trash compactor robot or a giant mecha octopus, both of which wildly vary in quality. The octopus isn't that bad given how big the arena is and the fact that you can jump higher due to the battle taking place underwater. It really is just the trash compactor being so unnecessarily annoying and just has way too many things going on. But on the flip side, if you don't kill them, you're going to be fighting them both again, both taking on vastly different forms. Bit and Byte fuse together to make this thing, and Vile comes back again, now with a fancy new ride armor. Bit and Byte just do the same attack over again, and Vile more or less does the same attacks as he did previously. But I don't know, man, even though I can acknowledge that these fights aren't that great, I still found that the fact that the previous battles have an effect later on in the game to be really cool. But I don't think it's as cool as this. If you go into this specific boss while playing a Zero and fight the mini-boss, the boss will very slowly and gently crash into Zero, causing him to be permanently damaged. God damn, that man just can't catch a break. But in doing this, X will obtain Zero's mighty and completely overpowered Z-Saber. It functions literally the exact same way as when you're playing a Zero, but it's still so cool. In retrospect, this seems to be a replacement for the Street Fighter moves present in the last 2 games, and to be honest, I don't really miss them at all. This makes a lot more sense for the type of game that X3 is, and if it managed to aim well enough, a little beam will shoot out that does stupid damage. Such a neat little secret, man. And you know, that's something that I've really taken note of this time around. The endgame of X3, for as unremarkable as the level design is just full of all these little secrets and hidden trinkets that no other game in the X series has. But enough shenanigans. After 35 minutes of Maverick refights, you finally face off against Mr. Duplo himself. You fight him in a pretty whatever boss fight, but oh my gosh, who could have seen it coming? It turns out that Sigma was behind the entire thing. That's crazy! So you go to the final stage and you confront Sigma face to face. Phase 1 is probably the easiest Sigma fight so far. Since you have the leg part enhancements by now, just cling on to the opposing wall and double dash between them while you slide down and give Sigma a nice rolling blade to the jaw. Phase 2 now is by far the most infamous. Sigma takes the form of this gigantic robot that moves very slowly and launches a bunch of missiles and stuff at you. What's the issue with this? Well, the fact that this man's hitbox is so unnecessarily small, as well as not really being all that clear. Apparently it's located somewhere between his face and the turbines on the top of the armor. Like, why not just make it his face? I don't know, like, I feel like it's one of those things that just makes this fight more annoying and difficult than it really should be. But after a while, you successfully dispatch him, and then he reverts back to his spirit form. Lava starts to rise as you climb your way up to the top, to the best of your ability of course, and depending on whether or not Zero is damaged, Sigma will either be stopped by either Zero or Duplo, with Duplo seeing the error in his ways and sacrificing himself for the greater good. X escapes the facility with him gazing at the wreckage of Duplo's lab either by himself or with Zero if he's kept alive. Once again, he's left to ponder about his adventure and how many things he's destroyed while going on it. Just looking at the remains of his lab kinda tears him up inside. He's just so uncertain about what the future holds for the Reploids, for the humans, for himself. And unfortunately, the future doesn't seem all that bright, as in order for there to truly be peace in this world, X is going to have to take the fight to someone who he would have never suspected as a threat. Zero. It sounds very weird and completely caught me off guard my first time, but this is something that the future games, particularly this game's follow-up, tend to give more context to. But with all that being said, X and Zero return back to the HQ, officially putting an end to Mega Man X3. Psych! We can't just wrap up the video yet, as there's still one more very important thing about X3 that needs to be discussed. So, sometime in 1996, this game actually got ported to both the PS1 and the Sega Saturn. It's pretty much beat for beat the exact same game with a bunch of tweaks. There are enhanced visual effects for some stages, it features redone music, which is actually a pretty big downgrade in my opinion, and it features some completely new animated intros as well as intros for every Maverick upon entering their stages. All of this stuff, and I mean every single new addition that they added, aside from the music, was fantastic and in every way outclasses the Super Nintendo version by a mile. But guys, come on. A side-scrolling action game released on a 32-bit system that came out in 1996? That's pretty much begging to be a flop. And flop it did, as this game just refused to sell. It didn't even get a North American release at all. Only Asian and European countries got access to it, and even still, no one played it. At this point, the writing was already on the wall. Even when given the chance to be played by more people, to get some time in the spotlight, X3 still gets ignored and overshadowed, gets buried and crushed by all the competition. And that's terrible. Say what you will about the game's quality, but no game, especially if it's an installment in such a well-renowned series, should ever be forgotten in the way that X3 was. Perhaps this reaction was due to X3's own undoing, because once again, the people who did play the game back then, and even nowadays, all came to the same consensus. This game was a complete mess, and to be honest, I can't really argue with that. X3 is a game that is absolutely a mess of ideas, concepts, experiments that all widely vary in quality. But something that I really wanted to emphasize while making this video is that X3 doesn't change things for the sake of changing things. It never felt like the devs were running out of ideas for the series, nor did it seem like they were just throwing things at the wall, hoping for something to stick. X3's goal was to be the definitive Mega Man X experience, taking elements from X1 and 2, as well as introducing a whole bunch of different things in an attempt to make this the biggest, grandest, most exciting and action-packed Mega Man X game yet. It's really surprising that a game that wasn't even made in-house at Capcom still looked back on its predecessors and found things to expand on. It really does seem like they wanted to end the X series run on 16-bit hardware with a massive bang, which again just makes it more upsetting that this game flopped as hard as it did. It's very easy for people like me, people who really enjoyed this game and admires its ambition, to look at the negativity as the industry just not wanting to accept the brilliance that 2D platformers still had. The fact is though, is that yes, while the industry was still experiencing some of those growing pains, 2D action platformers still never faded off completely after the shift. And Capcom absolutely took note of this, because in the same year that X3 released for the PS1, they would release a game that would show that no, it's not all over for Mega Man. He's not just a relic of the past. It's still possible for a legacy character to thrive and prosper in this modern age. This release would act as a gigantic burst of momentum for the franchise, and Capcom was not about to let it all go to waste.